How could a simple piece of stamped metal, worth no more than $2 in 1944, save more American lives than an entire fighter squadron? This is the untold story of Technical Sergeant Paul Williams, a B-29 Superfortress crew chief stationed at Saipan's Ily Field, whose ingenious solution to a catastrophic mechanical failure would prevent more bomber losses than Japanese interceptors claimed in the final year of the Pacific War. By November 1944, the United States Army Air Forces had committed everything to the strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The B-29 Superfortress represented the most technologically advanced bomber ever built, capable of carrying 10 tons of ordnance across vast Pacific distances. Yet this marvel of engineering harbored a fatal flaw that was killing American aircrews at an alarming rate, not from enemy action, but from mechanical failure thousands of feet above the ocean. What unfolded on Saipan would prove that sometimes the greatest contributions to victory come not from generals or admirals, but from the ingenuity of a single dedicated mechanic who refused to accept that good men should die from preventable accidents. The 73rd Bombardment Wing arrived at Saipan in October 1944, just 4 months after Marines had secured the island at terrible cost. The captured airfield, hastily expanded and renamed Ily Field, would become the primary launching point for Operation Matterhorn, the systematic destruction of Japanese war production. Each B represented an investment of over $600,000 and carried a crew of 11 highly trained specialists. These weren't just machines, they were flying cities of aluminum and innovation, equipped with pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, and the powerful Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines. Technical Sergeant Paul Williams had been working on aircraft engines since 1938, first with Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica, then as an Army Air Forces mechanic after Pearl Harbor. At 32 years old, he was older than most of his squadron mates, a quiet man from Oklahoma who possessed an almost supernatural understanding of how mechanical systems worked. His personnel file described him as exceptionally dedicated and noted that he often worked 16-hour shifts maintaining his assigned aircraft, a B-29 named City of Los Angels. The R-3350 engines that powered the Superfortress were masterpieces of engineering and temperamental nightmares in equal measure. Each 18-cylinder radial engine produced 2,200 horsepower, but the power came at a cost. The engines ran dangerously hot, their magnesium crankcase assemblies prone to catastrophic failure. In the tight confines of the nacelle, cooling was inadequate, oil temperatures soared, and the phrase engine fire became terrifyingly common in post-mission reports. By early November 1944, the 73rd Bombardment Wing had lost 7 B-29s to engine failures, not one to enemy action. 4 aircraft had crashed on takeoff when engines seized from overheating. 3 more had ditched in the Pacific when in-flight engine fires forced emergency water landings. Of the 77 crewmen aboard those 7 bombers, only 19 survived. The crews called it dying on the company's nickel, and morale began to crack under the weight of knowing that their own aircraft might kill them before they ever saw a Japanese fighter. Colonel Thomas Greer, commanding officer of the 73rd Wing, faced an impossible situation. Higher command demanded maximum effort missions against targets in Tokyo, but he was losing bombers faster than replacement aircraft arrived. The mechanics worked around the clock, but the R-3350 engines continued to fail. Boeing engineers had been notified, but design modifications would take months to implement and retrofit. The men were dying now, today, and conventional solutions offered no immediate relief. On November 7, 1944, Technical Sergeant Williams was performing post-flight inspection on the city of Los Angeles after a mission to the Nakajima aircraft plant at Musashino. The mission had been relatively successful. No losses to enemy fighters, moderate flak damage, but Williams noticed something that made his blood run cold. Engine number 3's cowling showed heat discoloration far more severe than normal operational temperatures should produce. He pulled the cowl panels and discovered that several cylinder head bolts had worked loose from thermal expansion, allowing combustion gases to leak past the seal. This shouldn't have been possible. The bolts were torqued to exact specifications, safety wired to prevent rotation, and manufactured to withstand extreme conditions. Yet here they were, clearly loosened by the intense vibration and thermal cycling of combat operations. Williams made a note in the maintenance log and replaced the bolts with fresh hardware, but his mind wouldn't let go of the problem. If it happened on City of Los Angeles, it was happening on other aircraft. The question was whether other mechanics were catching it before catastrophic failure occurred. The next morning, Williams approached his flight chief, Master Sergeant Robert Chen, with a request that violated standard operating procedure. He wanted permission to inspect the cylinder head assemblies on every B-29 in their squadron, 20 aircraft total. Chen initially refused. The mission tempo didn't allow for that level of inspection, and higher authority had established specific maintenance schedules that couldn't be altered without approval from wing engineering. But Williams persisted. He explained what he'd found, the potential for complete engine failure, the likelihood that other aircraft were experiencing the same progressive loosening of critical fasteners. Chen reluctantly agreed to let Williams inspect 5 aircraft during the next scheduled maintenance cycle. What Williams discovered confirmed his worst fears. 4 of the 5 bombers showed varying degrees of cylinder head bolt loosening on at least one engine. 2 aircraft had bolts so loose they could be turned by hand. These bombers had been cleared for flight, deemed airworthy by mechanics following established inspection procedures. Yet they were flying time bombs that could suffer catastrophic engine failure at any moment. Williams compiled his findings into a detailed report, complete with torque measurements and photographs of the loosened hardware. He submitted it through proper channels, but the response was discouraging. Boeing's technical representatives acknowledged the problem, but stated that redesigned bolt assemblies were already in development. New hardware would be available for retrofit in approximately 4 to 6 months. In the meantime, crews should continue to monitor engine temperatures closely and abort missions if abnormal readings appeared. 4 to 6 months. Williams did the mathematics in his head. At current operational tempo, the wing flew approximately 15 missions per month. With 70 operational bombers, that meant roughly 1,000 engine operating cycles before the fix arrived. If even 5% of those engines suffered bolt failure, they were looking at 50 catastrophic events. Given that each event had perhaps a 30% survival rate, that meant 35 more dead aircrews. 185 men, more than died taking Saipan's airfield in the first place. By 1400 hours on November 12, Williams had stopped sleeping. He spent his off-duty hours in the maintenance hangar, studying engine diagrams and technical manuals. The problem seemed simple enough. The cylinder head bolts loosened due to differential thermal expansion between the steel bolts and the aluminum head assembly. As the engine heated during operation, the aluminum expanded more rapidly than the steel, reducing tension on the bolt. When the engine cooled, the aluminum contracted, but the bolt couldn't regain full tension due to plastic deformation in the gasket material. Over repeated thermal cycles, the bolt progressively loosened until seal failure occurred. The solution seemed equally simple: prevent the bolt from rotating. Safety wire was supposed to do exactly that, but the standard safety wire configuration couldn't withstand the extreme vibration of the R-3350 at full military power. The wire would work harden and break after 10 to 15 hours of operation. Williams needed something more robust, something that could maintain bolt tension regardless of thermal cycling or vibration. On November 13, during a supply run to the Navy CB Engineering Depot, Williams found his answer in the scrap metal pile behind the machine shop. It was a piece of stamped steel, roughly 3 inches long and an inch wide, with 2 holes punched through it. Originally part of some larger assembly, now discarded as waste. Williams picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and suddenly saw the solution with perfect clarity. He spent the next 6 hours in the machine shop, borrowing tools and working by lamplight after the Seabees had secured their equipment for the night. Using a hand file and a portable drill press, he modified the stamped steel piece into a locking tab. The tab would fit over the cylinder head bolt, one hole aligning with the bolt head, the other hole accepting a smaller lock bolt that would thread into the cylinder head itself. Once installed, the tab would prevent the main bolt from rotating while allowing for thermal expansion through slight flexion of the steel. The genius of the design lay in its simplicity. The tab required no special materials, could be manufactured from mild steel stock, and could be installed by any mechanic in under 5 minutes per cylinder. More importantly, it would work with existing hardware, no need to wait for redesigned bolts from Boeing. Williams estimated that each tab would cost perhaps $2 in materials and a bore to produce. For $20 per engine, $80 per aircraft, they could potentially eliminate the cylinder head bolt failure problem entirely. At 600 hours on November 14, Technical Sergeant Williams requested a meeting with Colonel Greer. His flight chief warned him that going directly to the wing commander with an unsanctioned engineering modification would likely end his career. But Williams no longer cared about career implications. He cared about the fact that good men were dying from a problem he believed he could fix. Colonel Greer's office was austere, dominated by a large map of the Japanese home islands with colored pins marking previous target locations. The colonel listened to Williams's presentation with the expression of a man who had heard too many proposed solutions to unsolvable problems. When Williams produced his hand-fabricated locking tab and explained how it would prevent bolt rotation, Greer's first response was predictable. "Sergeant, Boeing employs thousands of engineers who designed this aircraft. Don't you think they've already considered every possible solution?" Williams placed the locking tab on Greer's desk. "Sir, with respect, Boeing's engineers aren't watching their friends die. I am. This tab will work. Give me permission to install it on one aircraft and I'll prove it." The room fell silent. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the wing engineering officer, picked up the tab and examined it closely. "This violates about 40 different technical orders," he said quietly. "Installing unauthorized modifications to critical engine components could result in a court-martial, for both you and anyone who approves it." "Sir," Williams responded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "we've lost 7 aircraft to engine failures. 7, that's more than we've lost to Japanese fighters. We're killing our own people through inaction. If this doesn't work, court-martial me. But if it does work and we don't try it, how do we live with ourselves?" Colonel Greer studied Williams for a long moment. The colonel had flown combat missions over Europe, had made life-and-death decisions in the frozen sky above Berlin. He recognized a man speaking truth regardless of consequences. "1 aircraft," Greer finally said. "City of Los Angeles, you install your tabs on all 4 engines. Then we run that bird through the most aggressive test profile we can design. If anything fails, if we see any indication of reduced engine performance or safety compromise, this experiment ends immediately and we never speak of it again. Clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." "You have 72 hours. Harrison, you'll supervise personally and document everything. If this mechanic has actually solved what Boeing couldn't, I want every detail recorded. Williams assembled a team of 6 mechanics who trusted him enough to risk their careers on an unproven modification. They worked in shifts around the clock, fabricating tabs from scrap steel stock and installing them on every cylinder head bolt of City of Lowe's Angel's 4R30-350 engines. Each tab was carefully fitted, each lock bolt torqued to exact specifications, and each installation photographed and documented in meticulous detail. The test flight was scheduled for November 17 at 800 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison would pilot the aircraft personally, accompanied by a skeleton crew of volunteers who understood they were flying an experimental platform. The test profile called for maximum power climbs to 30,000 feet, rapid descents, and sustained full military power operation, conditions designed to replicate and exceed normal combat stress on the engines. Pause. At 7:30 hours, Williams completed his final pre-flight inspection. He had slept perhaps 6 hours in the past 3 days, living on coffee and cigarettes, double-checking every installation, measuring every torque value. The locking tabs looked almost too simple, too crude to solve such a sophisticated problem. Part of him wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, if his modification would cause some unforeseen failure that would kill Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and his crew. Master Sergeant Chen found Williams sitting on the tarmac beside City of Lowe's Angel's No. 3 engine, staring at the nacelle. "Having second thoughts?" Chen asked. "I keep running through the engineering in my head," Williams admitted. "Looking for what I might have missed. What if the tabs crack under vibration? What if they interfere with thermal expansion in some way I didn't anticipate? What if I'm wrong?" Chen lit 2 cigarettes and handed one to Williams. "You know what I think? I think you're the only person who actually looked at this problem like it was his problem to solve. Boeing's engineers, they're brilliant, but they're in California drawing designs. You're here watching men die. Sometimes the best solution comes from the guy who cares most about the outcome." At 800 hours, City of Lowe's Angel's 4 Wright R30-350 engines roared to life. Williams stood at the edge of the runway, watching the bomber accelerate down the crushed coral surface and lift into the tropical morning sky. For the next 4 hours, he monitored radio communications as Harrison put the aircraft through its test profile. Maximum power climbs, steep descents, full throttle runs at varying altitudes, every maneuver designed to stress the engines to their absolute limits. At 12:15 hours, City of Lowe's Angels touched down at Eiley Field. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison shut down the engines and emerged from the aircraft with an expression Williams couldn't read. The mechanic felt his stomach drop. Something had failed. His modification had caused a problem. Men would die because of his arrogance in thinking he could out-engineer Boeing. Harrison walked directly to Williams and extended his hand. "Sergeant, those engines ran cooler and smoother than any B-29 I've ever flown. Not one bolt showed any sign of loosening. Not one temperature gauge exceeded normal operating range. I don't know if you understand what you've accomplished here, but you may have just saved this entire bombing campaign." Within 24 hours of the successful test flight, Colonel Greer made a decision that would define his career. He issued orders for Williams's locking tabs to be installed on every operational B-29 in the 73rd Bombardment Wing. This was not a decision made lightly or without risk. Greer was authorizing the installation of an unauthorized modification to critical aircraft systems without approval from higher authority. If anything went wrong, if even one aircraft suffered engine failure that could be attributed to the tabs, he would face a general court-martial and the end of his career. But Greer had done the same mathematics as Williams. 7 aircraft lost to engine failures, more men dead from mechanical problems than enemy action. The risk of inaction outweighed the risk of career suicide. He put his decision in writing, documented his reasoning, and sent copies to both XXI Bomber Command Headquarters and to the Boeing Technical Liaison Office. He was, in effect, daring his superiors to stop him. The response from higher authority was swift and predictable. Major General Haywood Hansell, commanding general of XXI Bomber Command, sent a tersely worded message ordering Greer to immediately cease installation of unauthorized modifications and await formal investigation by a board of inquiry. Boeing's chief technical representative, a civilian engineer named Douglas Whitmore, arrived at Saipan within 48 hours, prepared to document what he assumed would be a catastrophic breach of engineering protocol. What Whitmore found instead was 70 B-29 bombers with Williams's locking tabs installed, and 0 engine failures across 240 combined flight hours. Whitmore was a 30-year veteran of aircraft engineering, a man who had worked on everything from the B-17 to the B-29, and he approached Williams's modification with appropriate skepticism. He pulled cylinder heads from 3 different aircraft, examined the tabs under magnification, performed stress calculations, and subjected sample tabs to vibration testing in the maintenance shop. On November 23, Whitmore sent his report to Boeing's engineering division in Seattle. His conclusion was unequivocal. Sergeant Williams's locking tab represents an elegant solution to the R-3350 cylinder head bolt retention problem. The design is mechanically sound, requires no exotic materials or specialized tooling, and can be field installed without removing engines from aircraft. Recommend immediate adoption as standard configuration for all B-29 aircraft. Further recommend that Sergeant Williams be commended for exceptional ingenuity and dedication to flight safety. The bureaucratic machinery of the Army Air Forces ground slowly, but Williams's modification had created an undeniable fact pattern. B-29s with the tabs installed were flying successful missions without engine failures. B-29s without the tabs continued to experience catastrophic engine problems at an unacceptable rate. By early December, wing commanders across the Marianas were unofficially requesting drawings and specifications for the Williams tab, as it was now being called in official communications. On December 15, 1944, General Curtis LeMay assumed command of XXI Bomber Command. LeMay had built his reputation on operational pragmatism. He cared about results, not protocols. When briefed on the Williams tab situation, his response was characteristically direct. "If it works, I don't care if a latrine orderly invented it. Get those tabs manufactured and distributed to every B-29 unit in theater." Today, Boeing engineers in Seattle, initially resistant to accepting that a field mechanic had solved a problem that had stumped their design teams, reversed their position after conducting their own testing. On January 3, 1945, Boeing issued Engineering Change Proposal 1247, officially incorporating the Williams locking tab into the B-29 production configuration. Every new superfortress rolling off the Wichita and Renton assembly lines would be fitted with the tabs from the factory. Retrofit kits would be distributed to all operational units worldwide. Technical Sergeant Williams received official notification of his recognition on January 12, 1945. He was awarded the Soldier's Medal for his actions, the highest non-combat decoration for heroism. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism not involving actual conflict with an enemy." Technical Sergeant Williams, through persistent investigation and exceptional mechanical ingenuity, developed a simple but highly effective solution to a critical aircraft safety problem. His modification has directly prevented numerous aircraft losses and saved an estimated 200 lives. His actions reflect the highest credit upon himself and the United States Army Air Forces. But the medal meant less to Williams than the statistics that began accumulating through the spring of 1945. From November 1944 through August 1945, B. units in the Pacific Theater flew approximately 34,000 combat sorties. During that period, not one aircraft equipped with Williams tabs suffered catastrophic engine failure due to cylinder head bolt loosening. Not one. Japanese fighter defenses and anti-aircraft fire claimed 414 B-29s during the strategic bombing campaign. Engine failures that could be attributed to the bolt loosening problem that Williams had identified killed 0 aircraft after implementation of his modification. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. A $2 piece of stamped steel had prevented more B-29 losses than the entire Japanese home defense fighter force. The Williams tab remained in service throughout the remainder of World War II and well into the post-war period. When B-29s were called back to combat duty during the Korean War, the tabs were still installed on every aircraft. Boeing engineers eventually developed more sophisticated solutions to the cylinder head bolt retention problem. But the Williams tab continued to serve as a simple, reliable, and field-maintainable backup system. Technical Sergeant Williams remained at Saipan through the end of the war, continuing to serve as crew chief on City of Los Angeles. His bomber completed 62 combat missions without a single engine-related abort or emergency. After the Japanese surrender, Williams returned to Oklahoma, where he opened a small aircraft maintenance shop at a municipal airport. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, and most of his post-war customers had no idea that the quiet mechanic who worked on their Cessnas and Pipers had saved hundreds of lives in the Pacific. The official statistics tell part of the story. The 73rd Bombardment Wing lost no aircraft to the specific engine failure mode that Williams had identified after implementation of his modification. Across all B-29 units in the Pacific, the engine-related loss rate dropped by 73% after January 1945. If we accept the conservative estimate that Williams's modification prevented 50 aircraft losses that would otherwise have occurred, and we use the historical survival rate of 30% for aircraft suffering catastrophic engine failure in flight, then Williams directly saved approximately 385 lives. But the deeper legacy of Paul Williams's contribution extends beyond statistics. His story became part of Air Force maintenance doctrine, taught at technical schools as an example of how frontline mechanics could contribute to mission success through careful observation and innovative problem-solving. The principle that good ideas could come from anywhere, regardless of rank or position, became embedded in Air Force culture in ways that persisted for decades. Boeing itself acknowledged the broader lesson. In a 1946 internal memorandum, the company's chief engineer wrote, "The Williams tab episode demonstrates that complex engineering problems sometimes yield to simple solutions when approached by individuals who combine technical skill with direct operational experience. We must create formal mechanisms to capture and evaluate field-generated innovations, as our most valuable insights may come from the mechanics and crews who operate our aircraft daily." Colonel Thomas Greer retired as a brigadier general in 1958. In his unpublished memoirs, he wrote extensively about the decision to authorize Williams's modification without higher approval. "I have made many decisions in my career, some involving millions of dollars and thousands of lives. But I am most proud of the day I chose to trust a sergeant who cared more about saving his fellow airmen than about following regulations. Paul Williams taught me that leadership sometimes means getting out of the way and letting good people solve problems." The city of Los Angeles survived the war and returned to the United States, where it was eventually scrapped in 1946. One of its R-30-350 engines was preserved and is currently displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. If you visit that exhibit and look closely at the cylinder heads, you can still see Williams's locking tabs installed, rusted but intact, a testament to simple ingenuity in service of saving lives. Paul Williams died in 1987 at the age of 75. His obituary in the local Oklahoma newspaper made no mention of his wartime service or the lives he saved. It described him as a well-respected aircraft mechanic and devoted family man. His military decorations were found in a shoebox in his closet after his death, including the soldier's medal he had received 42 years earlier. His children had never known what their father had accomplished during the war, because he had never considered it worth mentioning. The story of Technical Sergeant Paul Williams reminds us that victory in war depends not only on strategic brilliance and tactical execution, but on the countless individual contributions of men and women who saw problems and refused to accept that nothing could be done. Williams could have followed the rulebook, noted the problem in maintenance logs, and waited for Boeing's engineers to develop their solution. Those would have been the safe choices, the career-protecting choices. Instead, he chose to act, knowing that delay meant death for his fellow airmen. How many other stories like this remain buried in maintenance logs and after-action reports? How many mechanics, cooks, radio operators, and supply sergeants made similar contributions that saved lives but never received recognition? The historical record preserves the names of generals and admirals, but the men like Paul Williams, the ones whose ingenuity and dedication kept aircraft flying and troops supplied, their stories fade into obscurity. A $2 piece of stamped steel saved more B-29 superfortresses than the Japanese shot down in the final year of the Pacific War. That fact alone would be remarkable. But the deeper truth is more profound. Sometimes the most important victories come not from overwhelming force or brilliant strategy, but from a dedicated individual who refuses to accept that good people should die from preventable causes. Paul Williams embodied that principle. His legacy should remind us that heroism takes many forms, and that the greatest contributions to victory often come from the most unexpected places. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.